Okay, guys, Blackspot. We everybody knows it. Everybody have seen it over the years. I saw a familiar face from somebody from New Zealand. This Blackspot. This Blackspot on pears normally shows up a little bit smaller than apples, but you can see those photos. There is a difference between the two. One is they have beautiful names, but it is an apple and pear spot, and basically they don't affect each other. There's two different species. And also, for example, roses, there's another species again. Again, what can affect it? Basically, apple scab can infect leaves, shoots, buds, but also blossom. We are probably not aware of that, but it can already affect basically the small fruits in blossom, and of course fruit, and we know the damage when we see it. This just a little bit about the background, disease circle. This the disease circle of apple and pear scab is a little bit different, not too much in the life circle. It is very, very similar, except that pear scab actually survive much better on wood than apple scab. Apple scab survive basically a little bit on the buds, but not so much on the wood, not on the 1 year wood like pear does. Again, everybody have seen this before. We are now on green tip at the moment. There's the spores are released. We can have black spot. So as soon as you have green parts on the trees, basically you can have an infection. If you have the leaves sending out spores, and then you can have in the summer infection. In the summer, it affects your leaves again, then becomes back to the leaves. Those lesions on the leaves in the winter, they basically survive on the old leaves and basically sometimes on the wood, like in pears. This is a lesion. The lesion basically sit there in the winter. Spring, like now, they're sending out the spores again, and you're sending out more spores when the temperature is right and affects your apples. And that's the full circle of black spot on apple and pear. It is not much different in this thing. There's again, the shoots on pears are much more common. And again, we actually would consider in Australia, I consider Williams much more susceptible than, for example, Peckhams. We see, and also we see it on the infections on the shoots much more on pears. And what you see is, we don't expect it, but when you got a very big infection, on pears, we get a much severe infection on, you see it straight away on the fruit. The fruit is more susceptible on pears than on apples. And again, just a little bit on the spore lesions on the wood. You can see this is how it survives on the pear wood, just small lesions. You see the cankerous a little bit as well around it. I think everybody has seen it. And this is the spore lesions on the side of your leaves. And you see that little bit of light brown come up, the light color. Again, you see it straight away that you got a black spot, but it's on the pears, it's definitely on the underside of the leaves. And on the apples as well. And again, black spot, it occurs basically worldwide. It is a very serious disease, widespread through all regions in Australia. Some people have it very less. Probably the only region in Australia where we see it much, it's like Riverland, but even that, in the 20 years that I've worked there, I've seen it once. It's again, in all regions in Australia, we have black spot. Again, black spot can survive on the male's species. And quite often in the orchard, when we got crab apples, we see that they survive on that. There's little apples stay behind and the spores stay on that. It's again, you quite often see those infections on those crab apples as pollinators. This again, apple scab is different than pears, but it is very close related. There's again, just a little bit about it. This Rimpro is a decision support system for not only black spot, but it is just for spraying. Again, we had a little discussion before. There is other systems around the world what predict the black spot. Rimpro is one of them. I manage it in Australia, but it is not the if and all. It is just one of the tools we use. And again, the mission from Rimpro is basically, it is a lot of background, a lot of researchers like Peter Trellows, they have been working on it, people who are very well known. And again, still work going on to today. If there is any changes of black spot resistance coming in for chemicals, they're still working on it. And again, Rimpro is nothing else than an internet platform where we have weather stations, and it is used by growers, consultants, and in 52 countries around the world. Coming back to the black spot again, just a little bit about spore maturing. These are the lesions. The lesions, remember, they survive the winter, the spores in the spring. And what you see on Rimpro here, you can see the spores are getting ready. The reds, and now my mouse is going a little bit ahead of me. Again, you can see the spores getting mature. So as soon as they get mature, basically the spores can go up in the air and affect the apples. There's a green tip. This is the model we start on green tip. In the old days, we actually tested for maturity from the spores. These days we don't, we go by green tip date. And I checked it over the years and it is very close to each other with the Rimpro model. There's again spore releases. This is how it's seen on Rimpro again. Remember, you got the lesions, they send the spores out. The yellow is what it is on Rimpro, that's the spores releasing. The red is the infection. And again, this is the spore, the mildew, basically the spores over the leaves. And that's where you get the damage from on the leaves. You see that again, this is the spores, the germination means that it spreads over the leaves. And that's what you see on this picture. This again, if you have no rain, this germination window stops. And that's why, but sometimes it goes a little bit longer and then you have to put a brake on it. But if you spray that, then, but this is more or less to give you an understanding from how the spores work on the leaves. And again, you see it, the mycelium is actually spores. They're going over the leaf in this area. And that's what we try to protect with our black spot control. Again, just a little bit and explain from what we see. David will talk about it a little bit more, but I want to everybody who has never seen it to understand that the blue line is basically today, this is coming. This Rimpro gives you a warning, and it gives you a warning for this infection. This you got actually a couple of days before the infection, and that's why Rimpro is in decision forecast. We forecast if the weather change, the infection change. And again, in Rimpro, we see high risk. This is a high infection risk, but you got an extreme risk that's very high. That you make sure that you got, for example, the daylands out before you got that, and then you got the low risk in the end. As you can see that, again, we make a differentiation from high risk, low risk. But again, if you have a low risk, it still can affect your apples. Again, it has to do with all the varieties as well. Pink Lady is much more susceptible. Some apple varieties are much less susceptible. This is all depending on which variety we have. Coming back to the secondary infection, these lesions, we saw them on the leaves before. Lesions send out much more spores than actually in primary infection. And the secondary infection is where we get quite often caught late in the season. And people forget how much spores comes from those lesions on the leaves. And in Rimpro, again, you can go to the top and put secondary infections on so that you can see how bad it is. The red is on the fruit, the yellow is on the green. You can actually click on it again and you can see if it is bad on leaves or on fruit. Sometimes fruit is more sensitive for black spot. Sometimes it is actually more on the leaves and you don't see it on the fruit. And we see that quite often that in pink ladies, for example, we see it first on the leaves and not so much on the apples. That comes later. Coming back to pear scab again, for the pear growers, it survived much more on the wood. You see that with the scab, You saw with the apples, we had the spores, the bank was full and the spore get mature. On pears, it works a little bit different. Those lesions are there. They need temperature. They basically build off again. But actually the lesions on pear wood can keep on building, dropping. And that's why you see the infections much more severe on pears than on apples. And again, here you see an example, and this is this year, by the way. It was green tip, and you saw already one infection on the pears. This is Shepparton. Again, everybody have seen that, how to control Blackspot. David will go in a little bit more, but Protectant is always better than cure. We got Protectant fungicides, and we try to cover this leaf with a Protectant. How it works is if you put a Protectant on, the spores fall on and Protectant and they get killed. And the other method is basically coming back with Kickbacks, and the Kickbacks is a curative fungicides. And what it means is you put on after the event, but it's one thing. People and most experts around the world, they say it kills the spores, and the other half say it don't kill the spores. There's actually it captured, and I believe that it. I'm the one who believes that it captured this. And Kickback don't kill spores; it captures it. It stops it from developing on the leaves. Keep that in mind. Protectant is always better than a cure. And I leave this up to David to explain this.
Okay, so I just need to put a little bit of background on why I chose to run with Rimpro. Many years ago, Marcel mentioned Peter Trilloff from Germany, a consultant over there, and scientists came out and gave a series of lectures on Blackspot. And I don't think I ever understood how the disease worked properly until he did that. We, as you can see from the weather data there collected last year, we are in a very high pressure Blackspot fungus type environment. You can see a whole lot of rain events, and Marcel, if you bring up that next one, it'll show the infections. This is a secondary, and the secondary is very dangerous because whilst it doesn't normally stay on wood over winter in apples, sometimes when we have a lot of growth, there's still leaves on trees like Pink Lady and softwood on younger blocks, where I'm absolutely certain that it does survive over there. So come spring, it isn't only the primary infection you've got to worry about, it's the secondary. So anyway, going back to Peter Trilloff, at that stage, he mentioned that they were working on a model with a guy called Mark Trapman from Holland, and I followed that. And when it was released commercially, I think Brad Fankhauser in Durham was the first one in Australia to get one, but I followed the next year. And what I found with Rimpro was it actually helps me understand how the disease works. And Marcel, if you go on now to the next slide, this is last year's infections. And as you can see, there's been 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 primary infections. And that's all in a period of 6 weeks. So those couple of early ones that you can see on the screen, really, really low down there, they're the really critical ones along with the secondary. So what it does is help me decide, and the next slide will show, it warns me about what's happening, and then it helps me decide what sprays I'm going to use. So if you put this year's up, Marcel.
Well, one sec before we go, very quickly, see, this is a spore bank. We talk about that, and you see the maturity, and then it becomes almost empty. With so many infections, the spores are available from the primary infection going down very quickly, and you can see that in the graph.
So the really interesting thing, go back slightly, Marcel, just go back to that slide again. The really interesting thing is before that large infection, the second really high one, you can see there's a lot of mature ascospores there, and there's a big release happening. That's why the risk is so high. And it's the same on the next one. There's quite a step down there. So this along the bottom helps you work out where you've got to throw your best effort at, if you like. because these are the greatest risk. And when you spray and how you spray and what you use is absolutely critical at these points. Once you start to get down here, you're nearly over the hump. So going on to the next one. So the really good thing about Rimpro, and there's probably others that have got it now, but the thing that really is great about Rimpro is the spray plan part that you can break on up the top. And what spray plan does is you enter your sprays and it shows you, based on science and whatever, the efficacy of the sprays that you're using. So if you look at this, it isn't the whole season, but my previous large event was back around on the 7th or 8th of September at the far left. And you can't see it on this, but there's quite a high one like that one over there. So prior to that one, I'd used a D-land spray. I'd used a copper spray, which is very good. But 2 days after I put it on, we had 70 odd mil in a day and a half, one of which was 50 odd mil. So what happened with that was that the efficacy of the copper dropped dramatically, and we came right down into the lower part of the fungicide cover, which is on the left of the table there. So I looked at that, it was a pretty high risk, and I said, I think this is when I need to use a kickback spray. So I chose, because we had, you can see we still had wet leaves here on the 8th of September. The light blue is wet leaves, moisture, and the dark blue is the rainfall events. So I said to myself, and you can see the maturity is getting down, and there's quite an infection period. So I said, I need a kickback, but I'm also got another rain event. Now the middle one, the one here in the middle that's quite low and it's got a low risk. Back when I made the decision to use the kickback and D-land, I thought there was a much higher risk. And this is one of the things with models. They change according to the weather. So the whole thing about using this, you've got to have a weather station. It's got to measure all the things that go toward, temperature, humidity, leaf wetness, rainfall, and temperature, because they're all the factors that influence. So what happened was it predicted based on my weather station and the Bureau of Meteorology, because it actually has access to the Australian Bureau of Meteorology. It was predicting quite a large infection around the 13th and 14th. So I chose to use Bogard, which has 4 and a bit days kickback, and D-land to provide the cover, because Bogard doesn't give you any forward cover or very minimal forward cover. And as you can see, I've had terrific cover. And even with this future rain event, remember on the right of the blue line, the light blue line, we're now looking at the infections coming up on Saturday and probably Monday, Tuesday. We're looking at what's happening there. So what I can use this for, and this is the really neat trick with this program, I can actually put in future spray covers to see what sort of effect I'm going to get. So I have put flint in, right, because I thought I'd use a different group to the Protectant, and I've chosen flint for 2 reasons. One, I know it can develop resistance, but I don't use it very often. And this is another good thing about this program. It keeps track in a list of things, what sprays you've used, and you know which groups you're playing with and which ones you aren't. So you're less likely to overuse it because it's actually sitting before your eyes when you look at it. So I chose flint, and as you can see, I'm going to get some pretty good cover coming up out of this next infection. So on the next slide, I thought, well, let's have a look at using a different spray. So Marcel, if you can go to the chorus. So I thought, oh, well, I'll whack chorus in and see what happens. Now, in Australia, it doesn't show that we get a kickback with chorus on the label, but obviously there is. But it's only 2 days, and it gives me equally effective cover of Protectant forward, but it's a pointless exercise putting on this kickback at this point in time because there's no real risk of infection. So I'm going to put that cartridge back in the box and keep it as ammunition for future infections when I do need a kickback. So going back to the Flint one, Marcel.
This one again?
This one. Why I chose this, and Marcel referred to it on Rimpro, and I would think other models as well. There is also powdery mildew, sooty mold, codlin moth, other things. But the reason I chose Bogo back here is that on this, just before this infection, there was actually a risk of powdery mildew infection. And that's the one that just about always gets away from us because we're not really conscious of powdery mildew infection before there's much flower or, pink. And I chose Bogo because, and I used it at the higher rate to protect against powdery mildew. So that, and there's not so much a chance of that with Flint of powdery coming up. That doesn't show it at the moment. But if this weather event and this infection event turns into anything like the last one and doesn't get as much grain or as much leaf wetness, there's a very strong chance there'll be another powdery infection. So I've chosen to run with Flint on this spray. So that's really why that's how I use Rimpro to help me make my decisions about sprays, so that where we use the curative or the DMIs or any of those that develop resistance, this can help me minimise the number of times I spray with it. So going back to the bar at the bottom, where it's white, there is no infection, there's no happening. Only if you've already got the infection does it continue to act. So there's no point putting a spray out anywhere across this from that date, the 15th, until the 18th. There's no point putting a spray on, say, on the 14th, because the damage has already been done if it's a protectant. So the longer you can leave that spray to the rain event coming, the better off you are with the effective cover you get going forward. So ideally, and I still have to look at my bureau site to see what the wind is likely to be on the 17th, okay? But if I decide that the 17th is going to be really windy, I'm probably going to spray tomorrow, which is why I put the chorus in where it is, but Flint would come there. So in combination, I'm using the bureau site for the wind, because Rimpro doesn't give you any predictions on that, but that's the only other thing that affects the decision. But in the end, I can cover my whole orchard in one day with a couple of spray pumps. The 17th is going to give me the best protection for this really large infection period coming up on the 21st, 22nd. By tomorrow and the day after, it'll be predicting when it ends. And then I'll have another look and say, am I going to put in another kickback? And almost certainly I will, because this is my last major event. When you look at the bar along the bottom, this is my last major infection. So I'm going to throw most of my ammunition at this infection, because when you look at the bottom, nearly all of the ascospores are over. So it's going to be a lot less risk going forward after this lot than normal. Now, if you go to another area where you don't have high pressure like this with a lot of rain events, what happens is you come further and further across the bottom there with everything in place, and then the disease knows that it's getting through, say, to petal fall or early whatever, and it's going to release a huge amount. And so it's much simpler probably to manage those sorts of events in their scenario where there's not a lot of infection in this particular one. But it's no guarantee you won't get black spot, that's for sure. But what it has done is allowed me, I guess, to get involved more with integrated pest and disease management, because this is just another tool in that whole package, and that's how I treat it. But I found it particularly useful, And you look, 2 years ago, I got black spot in a block of rosy glow because I'd put some grafts in there, and I probably didn't pay enough attention to the fact that those leaves were growing longer, and I would have got secondary infection, and I lost sight of the ball and didn't look at the secondary infection. So you've got to use all of this in together. You can't just rely on one part of it. But the most valuable part of all is definitely this spray plan. So I'll leave it there. I think that explains why I chose Rimpro as the one that I wanted to work with. But it's definitely helped me understand how the disease operates better.
Just very quickly before we go to questions, for people who have never seen Rimpo, this is basically your cover. The gray line means that you have cover. If you have more than 20% cover on your leaves, then this infection is still protectant. David got here almost 40, 50%. This infection would not take in place. That's all I want to say. I even leave it up to.
But Marcel, the other decision is even that D-land that was sprayed way back on the 10th is still going to have about at the first part of the infection, it's going to have 20. Yes. And if it was only that, you might say, oh, well, I won't spray. If this one wasn't here on the right, you might say, oh, look, I'll leave that go. I reckon that's enough. But it's just too big a risk at 20% sort of effectiveness to. And I know the other issue in all of this, you've got to watch your orchard. We have got a lot of leaf out there, not just flower. We've got a lot of leaf developing at the same time as flower. And when you've got a lot of leaf, as you saw from the secondary infections, you need to think a lot harder about how much more likely it is that there'll be infections because there's that much more surface area for the spores to land on. So it is an integrated decision.